Welcome back. Let's take you to this now. The truce between Israel and Hamas, which was due to expire last night, has been extended by 2 days. The two sides have completed the release of Israeli hostages and detained Palestinians under their original ceasefire deal and appear poised to free more. Now, Israel released 33 prisoners last night after 11 hostages were freed by Hamas. This brings the number of Israeli hostages released so far to 69. The Israel Prison Service said 33 Palestinian prisoners were released yesterday from Israel's Offa prison in the West Bank and from a detention center in Jerusalem, bringing the total number of Palestinians it has freed since Friday to 150. Both sides are reported to have released lists of more prisoners and hostages due to be freed today. Professor Chris Landsberg, Chair of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy and Director of the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership, joins us now for analysis. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So both sides have agreed to extend their ceasefire. Is there a likelihood of a permanent ceasefire, do you think?
It depends on a number of factors. I'm not that hopeful given Israel and America's attitude. I'm going to look very carefully at U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's shuttle diplomacy visit during the course of the next few days, the next 5 days or so. Of course, Hamas and the Arab leaders in general would welcome not just a permanent truce, but a permanent ceasefire. And then the big question is what happens next? Will they negotiate the future of Palestine in a serious way? Israel, on the other hand, just briefly, seems to have been battered into a corner, ironically, not so much by the international community. It's been very defiant of the United Nations, of European nations, even of Arab states. Some have not taken kindly to Israel's obdurate stance. But they've been battered into a corner by the families of the hostages. And I just want to end by saying to you on this particular note, you may have some follow-ups, but I foresee some setbacks even with the hostage process. For example, some reports have it that not all 240 hostages are held by Hamas, but could be held by 1 or 2 other militant groups from Palestine as well. Now, if that's the case, how do you secure that those hostages get to Hamas and to the ICRC and then to Israel? Because the Israelis would look for any excuse to accuse Hamas of having violated the truce.
And just staying on that point in terms of the discrepancies, especially when it relates to hostages. Of course, we've seen reports that are very conflicting in as far as, where these hostages are held. And I mean, the outcry perhaps from these families is that if you are desperate to release the hostages and negotiate for their freedom, why are you then bombing indiscriminately? And there has not been a real tangible response from Israel. Is this because there is, to a large extent, pressure for the president, for the prime minister, because given even before the 7th of October, the pressure that he was getting from a lot of people in Israel in terms of his leadership stance, and of course wanting him out essentially.
Sure, and not so much his leadership style. There was almost an angry response from the families of the hostages, which couldn't understand that if, as Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed and professed, that the release of the hostages alongside the quote-unquote total eradication and elimination of Hamas are his two central objectives. If it's true that one of those objectives were the release of hostages, then why do you go on this ferocious, scorched earth bombing campaign that ran the risk? And I wouldn't be surprised in the weeks to come if we learn, tragically, that some of the hostages, some of the 240 hostages that were originally taken on the 7th of October have succumbed, and then you're going to have a war of words. Was it Hamas? Was it Israel? But I want to make the point, just to latch on to something you've said. It's almost a man who reacted with a sense of rage and anger, in part because he couldn't prevent the 7th of October. Remember, the Israeli intelligence service and army is loathed throughout the world for being one of the best, one of the most professional, one of the most astute at their job. But they did not see the 7th of October coming. And it's almost a man who responds with anger. Let me just add one short footnote to that point. You can imagine now, with the hostages being released, there is a likelihood. Of course, I'm building, scenarios here in my own head, where those that are released are now being asked, do they know where they were taken to? Do they know where Hamas operated from? Can they recollect which buildings they were they were kept hostage, so that Israel could, after that last hostage is released, if this hostage process goes forward smoothly under the circumstances, so that Israel can go on a second offensive with even more determination, albeit this time around they are under so much pressure from abroad and at home that they would try and minimize casualties. Can I just say what I found so funny about this hostage thing? So you've just given us a figure that about 150 hostages has been released on the Israeli, prisoners have been released on the Israeli side already. And guess what? 150 have been arrested in the West Bank. I mean, how genuine is this? And I find this on the part of the Arab world, on the part of the Western world, America, Europe. I mean, Germany is taking a hardline stance on this that is unbelievable. But nobody is speaking about the fact that it's almost like 150 who are in prison are being released, but at the same time you continue to go to the West Bank and you capture 150 more.
And I mean, just going to the West Bank is also an interesting one, given the fact that it is Hamas that they are looking for, and they have earmarked Gaza where they are stationed. But also in terms of the hostages, the captured from the Israeli side, we're talking half of them being children. Some of them are younger than 15, Prof. So that is another thing that has shocked the world. But just let's look at another component now, and that is the humanitarian crisis that we are currently seeing now. Of course, there are warnings that more will die from disease, as the war continues because of the circumstances that Gaza now finds itself in. I mean, there is no clean running water. The sanitation is in a dismal state. In terms of both parties having violated, humanitarian laws, in as far and to the extent that they have, what are the consequences, particularly for both parties? Should there be a permanent ceasefire in this particular war?
So I'm very glad you asked that question for one reason. There has been confusion. Even when South Africa reported the carnage and the war taking place in Palestine, and our president and our minister of international relations, they've been very careful to say, look at the conduct of of both sides. Now, what many people are not aware of, since 2018, there has been the Palestinian issue on the agenda of the ICC. What many people are not aware of, however, is that the tensions between Ramallah and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, who actually won an election, albeit in 2006, as far back as that's one of the cases there. But to answer your question more directly, I don't see, sadly, a weaponized international criminal court in The Hague hastily going after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet and the armed forces. At best, it'll be a dragged out process by them. In fact, I'll go as far as saying to you, America, the European Union, Western leaders who went to Tel Aviv to declare their open support for Prime Minister Netanyahu and say to him that he has a right to defend himself. What is actually interesting about that is that they gave him a blank check. And it's almost that one of the reasons why they're wanting to pull back on these heavy bombardments with massive civilian casualties is because they don't want him to aggravate the chances of him being held before the ICC. That'll be unprecedented, by the way.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. That's all we have time for, unfortunately, this afternoon. Professor Chris Landsberg, there, Chair of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, also the Director of the Center of African Diplomacy and Leadership, giving us his analysis there.